there was a period of calm. But students don't like calm, particularly university students. Life needs to be exciting and needs to have thrills, and there are all these exciting movements all around the world. 1968's in the streets of Paris and in Germany, left-wing students had rioted against police officers. Martin Luther King, 1968, had been planning to march to Washington with the poor. The people of Queen's University, Belfast, decided that they'd like a piece of that. And so the students there formed a group called the People's Democracy, a much more radical group. NICA, you will remember, had decided that they were not going to march after O'Neill's appeal. They said, right, we're at a crossroads, we're going to stop, marches will be banned until we can negotiate a better way forward. People's Democracy thought not a bit of that, where's the fun? They organised a number of different sit-ins. They, for example, went up to Parliament and sat in and refused to budge, and so the Parliament couldn't take place, and so they were carted out eventually. They were a bit of a nuisance until they came up with the wonderful plan to march all the way from Belfast to Derry, 120-kilometre trek, and they would do this over the New Year period. There were only about 50 students took part in this. By the end of the march, there would be a riot involving thousands, which would spread out and would cause difficulty all over Northern Ireland. How did that happen? Well, People's Democracy weren't fools. By this stage, the majority of Protestants were beginning to view civil rights as a Catholic matter. The vast majority of people who were marching for civil rights were beginning to realise that Protestants were turning against them. Protestants were beginning to write letters into the paper and complaining about these Catholics who are causing these problems and these difficulties. Civil rights was becoming a more sectarian issue than it had been previously. So People's Democracy decided that they would take their march all the way from Belfast to Derry and walk past every Protestant area that they could possibly get near on the way and try basically to provoke trouble, which is what they got. At a place called Burntollet Bridge outside Derry, the police who were guarding them, and had guarded them quite effectively the whole way up to Burntollet, eventually lost discipline. It depends on who you listen to, but according to Catholic witnesses who were there, the police practically joined in as the marchers from People's Democracy were attacked by a mob which may have contained off-duty B special officers, the very men who had been employed part-time to keep the peace in Northern Ireland. Now some of them seem to be doing their damnedest to bring the whole place crashing down around our ears. There was a tremendous amount of anger in Derry when they heard about this ambush at Burntollet Bridge, and crowds of thousands came out to join the marchers as they entered Derry and made their way to the Guildhall, which of course was fairly near Protestant areas and caused a great deal of tension. And naturally, with it being Northern Ireland, some people had travelled to Derry. Some Protestant people had travelled there just so that they could be offended and be annoyed by the fact that Catholic marchers were coming in. Rioting broke out. Police officers invaded Catholic areas. In some cases, they practically joined in the rioting themselves. Now, about 75 police officers had been injured guarding the march up into Derry. Many police officers were tired, demoralised, had been attacked by members of their own community. The vast majority of RUC men were Protestant and had been attacked by Protestants. They were defending Catholics, and now they were being blamed for the one incident which had taken place. Tempers snapped. They went into Catholic areas, windows were broken, doors were kicked in. Police effectively became criminals, or at least some of them did. And it doesn't matter if if 3,490 police officers keep their calm, but 10 don't. It's the 10 who will get attention. It was significantly more than 10, by the way, who kicked in doors and smashed windows. But the minority of police officers began to make this look like this was a massive Protestant pogrom against the Catholic people of Northern Ireland. And so trouble broke out. People's Democracy began to organise marches elsewhere in Northern Ireland. These were terribly organised and inevitably ended in trouble. The British government was absolutely horrified by what was going on. They were worried that they were going to have to send in troops. It was at this stage that O'Neill was really coming under tremendous pressure from the British government to do something. There were Protestants who were resigning because O'Neill was organising a Cameron Commission to try and work out, it was led by Lord Cameron, to try and work out why this rioting was taking place. And so hardliner unionists who opposed O'Neill, and to be honest, would have liked his job, were resigning and opposing him. O'Neill felt like he was at a crossroads, and so he decided to call an election. It was his crossroads election, and this was his chance to try and bring everything to a halt. It was an incredibly courageous move, and it was a high-risk move. And even more, I don't know whether you call it courageous or whether you call it naive or just plain stupid, but he decided to try to reach out to Roman Catholics, and he went into different areas. For example, he went into the Old Park area of Belfast to meet Roman Catholics to try and get them to vote for him. One poor woman who lived in Old Park, Mrs. Mary McNulty, was photographed with him and showing him around her palace of a home. Home was later vandalised by nationalists who lived in that area because they had O'Neill in. O'Neill didn't seem to realise that people couldn't just say, I'm going to vote Unionist because I think O'Neill's a very nice man, if they lived in a hardline nationalist area. He was never going to be able to appeal into those areas. And against him there was Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley ran against O'Neill in his own area and nearly beat him. A number of anti-O'Neill MPs who were against his reforms ran that year and were elected. O'Neill had called the election to try and gain support for compromise, and instead what he found is that Unionists were turning away from compromise. Then in March and April 1969, a number of bombs went off at electricity power stations and reservoirs. Some of those reservoirs supplied over half of Belfast's water. When these bombs went off, immediately everybody assumed it was the IRA. In fact, it was Protestant paramilitaries, possibly, and up until very recently everybody said the UVF. There were other groups around at the time. The Protestant paramilitary world at the time isn't very well understood. Not too many people write biographies or write down all the details of their criminal past without leaving out certain key details and certain key facts. But after those bombs went off, O'Neill had to resign. It looked as if there was a Catholic uprising, a nationalist uprising, an IRA uprising, and he was trying to compromise with the people who were blowing up power stations, who were blowing up reservoirs. In fact, what had happened is that Protestant paramilitaries had set the whole thing up. It was a conspiracy. And O'Neill said those bombs basically blew him out of office. Protestant paramilitaries have been a problem for O'Neill since 1966, when a number of Catholics have been killed in Belfast by a small UVF that was trying to organise. And eventually this group in 1966, which O'Neill had used the Special Powers Act to shut down, would re-emerge and effectively blew him out of office. This is anti-democratic as you could get. The people had still voted for O'Neill. Bombs got rid of him. But of course his opponents said this was a great day for unionism, because at the end of the day this is Northern Ireland. Things you would have thought would have calmed down, but of course they wouldn't. In May, Major James Chichester Clark was elected UUP leader by one vote over Brian Faulkner. Poor old Brian Faulkner still not managing to control the party. Basically, O'Neill voted for James Chichester Clark. He was also his cousin, but at the time he says, Jimmy's only been plotting against me for a few months. Faulkner's been doing it for years. And so he picked the lesser of two evils and went for James Chichester Clark. Chichester Clark declared an amnesty. He said, listen, if you have been involved in rioting or any trouble up until this stage, no charges will be brought against you. You've got a blank slate. You do not go to jail. There's nothing to worry about here. He said he would introduce one man, one vote in local government elections, which was a bit rich, seeing this is one of the reasons he had at one stage resigned from O'Neill's government, because O'Neill was considering bringing in one man, one vote, and Chichester Clark says, well, I'm having none of that. But eventually he said no, after he had spoken to the British Prime Minister, and the British Prime Minister had pointed out to him that Britain was sending millions of pounds every year to Northern Ireland, and he expected something for his money, like democracy, just to see how it worked. Chichester Clark agreed to bring in one man, one vote. They reduced drastically, the British government reduced the number of councillors in Northern Ireland. There was a definite effort here to try and bring this whole thing under control before it exploded. And even Chichester Clark, who was a traditionalist, was doing his very best to try to persuade unionists and to try and persuade his government, listen, a hardline approach is not the way to go. Listen, we have to compromise. We've got to compromise effectively because we have to compromise with the British Prime Minister, who gives us most of our money to run this province. He wants us to compromise with nationalists, so we've got to compromise with nationalists. We've got to compromise with the civil rights movement. We've got to do that. Unionists are nothing if not consistent or stubborn or stupid, depending on how you want to look at it, and most of them says, well, we're not having a bit of that. And so Chichester Clark faced difficulties from the very beginning as well, even though he was a traditionalist. The marching season arrived, and of course this is always a tense time in Northern Ireland. Still is today. There still can be minor incidents during the marching season, and incredibly in July, which is when most of the major parades take place, July in 1969, there was no real trouble. August was a different matter, and it was in Londonderry or Derry again where things fell apart once again. There was terror coming up to the 12th of August for the Apprentice Days March in nationalist areas, in particular in Derry. They believed, and word went around, that the Unionists were planning to come in to the Bogside and into Catholic areas to smash, to attack, to kill. At one stage, way back at the time of Burntollet Bridge, they had put up barricades in these areas to keep even the police out, but they've been brought down. There had been sort of peaceful relationships, if you like, between people living in the hardline nationalist areas and the rest of Derry, but they were really terrified that something would go wrong, that there would be an attack on the Catholic people of Londonderry. And they were scared. There were some talks between the Apprentice Boys and the Derry Citizens Actions Committee. There were talks, there were attempts to try and keep everything under control. They weren't terribly well organised. What happened was the Apprentice Boys had their march. Legend tells us it was Big Ed Harrigan, a Catholic who allegedly threw the first stone, which started the Battle of the Bogside. People say, well, I mean, it goes back to the old question of who started it. I mean, the nationalists say that chants and slogans and beer bottles were thrown at them. Some people say, no, it was the Catholics who threw first. The answer in Northern Ireland as to who started is idiots. Idiots started it. That's just how these things go. But there was tension. The legend is that the Big Ed Harrigan was the first Catholic to throw a stone from behind the barricade. For most of the day, the police managed to keep the two crowds apart. Unfortunately, about 5 p.m, the police decided that they were losing control of the situation, that they needed to push the Catholics back. The Catholics had put up barricades to try and protect their areas, so the police pushed a Land Rover, and after about 7 or 8 attempts, they brought down a barricade at Rossville Street. 100 RUC officers began to pursue the Catholics who'd been throwing stones, and that's when things fell apart, because of course there was a Protestant mob behind them. And from the Catholic perspective, what you see from your advantage in a place like Divis, or from the Bogside and the flats in the Bogside, and you're looking down, and what you see coming towards you, and what people see coming towards them, are 100 police officers with riot gear, and behind them are the Apprentice Boys. And you've heard stories that the Apprentice Boys are planning an attack in your area and are going to burn people out of their houses. And you've heard your defences, and so of course you attack. And so 100 police officers were immediately pelted with stones, petrol bombs came flying their directions, and that was the beginning of the Battle of the Bogside. If it had been contained to Londonderry, that would have been alright. That would have maybe something we could have coped with. But nobody really intended the troubles to break out after the Battle of the Bogside, but they did. There were two massive mistakes made on the nationalist side and one massive mistake on the Protestant side. On the Protestant or Unionist side, there was this determination that the RUC could handle it. The RUC was capable of keeping control. There were 3,500 officers. The B specials, the government knew that they could not trust not to make the situation worse. So you were relying on 3,500 officers to keep the marching season, to keep calm in Northern Ireland. That was never going to work. And of course, what would inevitably happen is if the police have got two warring sides, it's much easier to focus your attention on one. And so it looked on many occasions like the police were taking the Protestant side, the side of Protestant mobs, and you're going to find Protestant mobs involved here. So that was the Unionist mistake, this determination on the part of the Unionist government to say, no, the RUC can handle it. Chichester Clark should have been asking for help from Great Britain long before this stage. He should have at least asked for troops. He actually could have asked, could we have police officers? That doesn't seem to have crossed anybody's mind. He could have said, listen, could we get police officers from London and Scotland and from all, could we crowd Northern Ireland with a civilian police force? That doesn't seem to have crossed anybody's mind at the time, including the government in London. But he should have asked for troops. He should have said, listen, can we have soldiers on the streets to keep order? But he didn't want to make it look as if he couldn't handle the situation. He didn't want to make it look as if Unionists couldn't control Northern Ireland. And that was a critical mistake. On the nationalist or Republican side, however you want to frame it, there are two massive mistakes. The first was the official IRA's decision to try to distract attention away from the Bogside by starting trouble in Belfast. And so there were a number of arson attacks on properties. There were stones and bricks thrown at RUC barracks. And the big problem at this stage is that there simply were not enough IRA men to really defend Catholic areas. There were about 120 volunteers in the IRA, and between them they may have had 24 guns to defend all the Catholics of Belfast if the Protestants turned against them. So they, in an attempt to try and draw pressure away from the people in the Bogside and to draw police into Belfast to give the Bogside a chance to defend itself. Because remember, these guys don't know exactly what's going on up in Derry. I mean, is there some sort of lynch mob going on up there? What exactly is happening in Derry? And they're under pressure from their own side to defend Catholic areas. And so they decided, right, we'll start a few attacks in Belfast. But they couldn't maintain any momentum. They couldn't effectively defend Catholic areas. There were too few of them. But then to top it all off, in the south of Ireland, Jack Lynch, the Irish Taoiseach, or Prime Minister we would call him, he decided to come on television. Now, believe it or not, Jack Lynch was actually having his own difficulties because there were people in the Irish government who were saying, let's invade Northern Ireland. Let's invade Northern Ireland. Let's send our troops in. Let's attack the Unionists. And then the United Nations will back us up. And Jack Lynch was said, listen, that's not going to happen. We can't fight the British Army. We'll be wiped out. There was a possibility of genuine civil war, a possibility of genuine terrible bloodshed that evening. So Jack Lynch said, listen, I'm going to go on TV and make a statement and try and show that we're on the side of the nationalists in Derry. And so to keep his hardliners calm, he went on television and said, listen, the Irish Parliament, the Irish government, the Irish people will not stand by while our people are massacred in Derry. And he moved the Irish army up to the border. Now, he was really creating field hospitals quite near Derry so that people who were injured could be treated and things like that. He didn't say that on TV, he just moved the Irish army up. So of course the Protestants thought that this was going to be an invasion of the North. They thought, after the bombs the year before at the power stations, after all this talk of the IRA controlling civil rights, they thought, well, this is it. This is the beginning of the end. This is an Irish attack on Ireland. This is the end of Northern Ireland. We've got to defend ourselves. And so within a short space of time, Protestant mobs were descending on Catholic areas. There were deaths. The provisional IRA would emerge after this, as the official IRA ran in Belfast on this stage. The IRA would split afterwards because there was an argument that the IRA did not do enough to defend Catholic areas. The official IRA probably actually did a lot more than were given credit for, but many Catholic areas were burnt to the ground. There were 76 RUC officers injured. There were 199 Protestants injured, 61 of those by gunfire. So there obviously was a defence of Catholic areas by the official IRA, and in places it was quite effective. In other places it wasn't effective. There were 178 Catholics injured. 2 Protestants were killed by gunfire. 5 Catholics were killed by gunfire. Catholics defended the official IRA, like I said, for example, at St. Gombal's School and places like that. There seems to be an effective defences. In other areas there were not. The RUC, incredibly, in places they opened fire with some machine guns. Of the 5 Catholic dead, one was a taxi driver who was sheltering in his house. The other was a 9-year-old boy, because they sent in armoured cars with 9mm Browning machine guns on them, which opened fire. These were high velocity rounds, and a 9-year-old boy was shot in his head while sheltering in his home. Of course, that caused huge amounts of anger, and it would lead to something called the Hunt Report, which very quickly after these riots would decide that the RUC should be disarmed, that the B Special should be disbanded, and that the UDR would be created to defend border areas. But of course, the only way to get control, and this was the big moment in the history of the Troubles, after the Battle of the Bogside, British soldiers had to come out onto the streets to protect Catholics. The first people to be killed by British soldiers in Northern Ireland were Protestants. They called the Battle of the Shankill. It took place in October later that year. They were protesting against that Hunt Report, which was disarming the RUC, which was disbanding the B Specials, and the British Army actually had to open fire on Protestants. Initially, the army came in to protect Catholic areas and to restore civil order, to protect the civil power, is what they were told. They weren't in as an anti-Catholic force. They weren't in to make Great Britain great. They certainly weren't in for that. But a group within the IRA had a very different idea. A group within the IRA, who would later become the Provisional IRA, decided to split. The IRA would split into the officials and the provosts. They felt that the IRA should be primarily Catholic. It should be nationalist. It shouldn't be about the working classes. It shouldn't be about protecting the working man like the official IRA had always preached. That's the first point. Second point is, they said never again will Catholic areas be left undefended as they were after the Battle of the Bogside. That will never happen again. August 1969 is never going to happen again. So that was their second point. They were going to be an aggressive, they were going to march aggressive defences of Catholic areas. But they drew a few other conclusions. They looked at civil rights marches, and they looked at people's democracy, and they said civil rights does not work. Northern Ireland is a failed state, and the only reason that there are men unionists in charge at Stormont is because the British government sent in soldiers to prop them up. Without those soldiers, they would have lost control, and they would not be in power. If we want to have a fair deal for Catholics in Ireland, we have to drive the Brits out. We have to attack the British soldiers. We have to show Britain that it cannot use its armed forces to protect unionist bigots in Stormont. That was the plan. And so after they defended Catholic areas, what they decided that they would do is there were two more stages to their plan. First of all, defend part one of a three-part plan, defend Catholic areas. Part two, go on the offensive. They would plant fire bombs in shops in Belfast. They would do economic damage, and that would bring soldiers into Catholic areas to search homes for bomb making factories, for materials that people were using to make bombs. And when the soldiers came in, they would start riots. They would get the youth out to throw stones. They would cause friction between British soldiers and Catholic youth. That was part two of their plan. And then part three is they would go on the offensive against the British Army. They would go on the offensive against the RUC. They would go on the offensive against the people who were keeping Stormont in power. They had that 3-point plan. And of course the officials, the official IRA, had to try to keep up with the provisionals. They had to try to show, look, we can do those things too. And so it was this decision to act by a small group of people which leads to armed conflict. It was as bad on the Protestant side. There was a group, this is before the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, but there was a group called the Shankill Defence Association, which was run by a man called John McCaig. And what you can do is you can look in 1969 and you can look at a map of Belfast and Londonderry, and you can see very, very strong Protestant areas, very traditional Catholic areas, traditional Protestant areas, hardline areas, areas that always voted for their community, run down, poor. You'd expect rioting in all those areas, but there was not. There was only rioting where paramilitaries were present and active. Where the Shankill Defence Association and groups like that were active, Protestant mobs came out to attack Catholics. Where the IRA was active, that's where there was trouble, where there were attacks on police stations. There was a choice made here in 1969 by different individuals that they were going to turn this into something more than it had been. What was initially an argument about civil rights, what was initially an argument about what happens in a democracy, would become a sectarian war, would become about which majority would rule, who was going to be the minority, who was going to put their boot on somebody else's neck. And that's how Northern Ireland falls apart.